Hey y'all, welcome back to Revolutionary Being. And if you're new, then welcome. Wow, what a week it has been on the old interwebs, discussing one of the most polarizing and emotionally driven topics of our time, or probably of all time, really, in our country, which is this, so-called pro-life, uh, pro-choice debate. It's one of those topics that's really fallen into a lot of sort of ideological, like crusty ideological framing. And it was a tough one for me. Well, first of all, it's interesting because I talk a lot about how they capture our attention with these ideological sort of narratives, these manufactured narratives. And this obviously was one of those. I mean, the leak, come on, that was on purpose. The timing of it's obviously all like a manufactured attempt to capture our attention and drive our will and get us to kind of squabble over things that most of us really have no control over anyway. And at the same time, I found myself really deep diving into what my value structures and beliefs were around this subject. And it was one of those subjects, I talked about this in my last video, about how the conscience can really be sort of wired into this cultural lid through the groups we identify with, through culture, through society, through the narratives we choose, and also through our own internal conscience and beliefs. And sometimes that's wired through trauma. And how difficult it can be to rediscover our values and morals and redefine them over time, and how important it is for us to stay flexible in redefining those when necessary, when exposed to new information, and when the mind sort of gets updated into new levels of perception and things like that. So this was one of those moments for me, being someone who's always been pro-choice, where I did a much deeper dive into like all the ins and outs of that world. And I really had to look at my own value structures around, like, for example, my value hierarchy, the top of my value hierarchy is generally liberty, individual liberty. But when you get to this discussion, and when you believe in the human spirit and the human soul, that gets a little bit murky, because obviously right off the bat, I could say, well, I believe in individual liberty. I believe in the mother's right to choose, which is what I've always believed. However, once I started seeing the baby in the womb as an individual spirit, I really started to struggle with that in my own kind of internal value structure, and the way it was being challenged. And so I went into that really like, oh shit, I don't know if this really plays out the way I thought it did. And I've attempted to traverse this subject like a couple times, well, one time in particular in the past, a few years ago when it came up. And I really attempted to stay kind of in the middle of the argument. And I still attracted people that were committed to polarizing. So I don't think that taking a somewhat of an extreme view really adds to polarization. I think the polarization is already there. So if you believe in something, you express it the way you feel you should express it. But at the same time, it's like I can see both sides of that argument. I really can, and I'm a woman, who reserved that backup plan in my mind for most of my life, and yet I had women around me who had done it and then had regrets, and they really had a lot of deep trauma around it. And anyway, so when I started to look more deeply, not only into the industry and how dark the industry around Planned Parenthood is, and all the black market stuff that's going on, and I also started really connecting into what motherhood is and what that child actually is. And I started to have to ask myself, well, at what point does this child become a human spirit that deserves the same rights as its mother and father? You know, at what point, we know it's not technically autonomous, but in a way it is. And so that's something I think we all need to take a little bit of a deeper dive into. And you might still come out the other side completely pro-choice, or you might still come out the other side pro-choice with much more restrictions and limits, which that's how I came out of it. I came out of it pro-choice with way more restrictions and limits. I have no problem whatsoever with an 8-week or maybe even a 6-week bill, you know, where it's like there's a heartbeat, then it shouldn't be really allowed. And I have no problem whatsoever with it being much more difficult. But I do think there are cases, and I do think we need to reserve room for autonomy, both in the mother and the child. So anyway, that's, I just wanted to like update you on my spiel with that. I know it's been kind of an intense week of posts and stuff. And yeah, I just wanted to share with you that journey of really questioning one's own sort of decided things. It's like we all need to question these from time to time and go, wait a minute, is this really right? Like, is this really right? You know, and for me personally, I can't even believe I ever thought that baby wasn't entitled to rights. It really was like waking up from a nightmare this week, like really seeing that so clearly in a way that's like, wow, I can't believe I ever took human life for granted. And that's the other part of the conversation. It's like, whether or not we can legislate it or not, that's one thing. But as a culture, the consciousness in the culture, we need to get to the place where we stop taking human life for granted and we stop objectifying human life, you know, and we stop pathologizing nature and natural human functions, and we start honoring motherhood and we start honoring human life, right? It's like, stop removing the humanity from the discussion. If you're going to be pro-choice, at least acknowledge the humanity in the womb. That's where I'm at. And once I started acknowledging that decision got a lot more intense for me. So anyway, that's my spiel about that. I'm going to move on with my actual video, which is a continuation of my last video about trauma-based mind control and the hijacking of human will. And I'm going to be, hopefully, you know, I got to trust my creative process, so there might be some other videos that come in between, but there's going to be a series unfolding that goes with this about the biointelligence of the will center. But before I totally dive into that biointelligence, I really want to talk today about how this biointelligence has to do with disassociation or disembodiment. And that's sort of the entry point for coming back into consciousness with our will, is embodiment and coming back into the body and coming out of this disassociative place. And I'm going to be covering techniques here, including this yoga nidra, right, for mastering the attention center in the body and synchronizing the hemispheres of the brain in the body and aligning with our conscious intention from within the body. So this video is going to be a little bit about attention and intention and dissociation, disembodiment, but coming back into embodiment to take command of our will center. And, you know, going back a little bit, like, this is one of the things I'm seeing, not just with this debate around motherhood and around life in the womb and birth, but also around the transgender issue, which I'll get to a little bit later. But this dehumanization or this disconnection from our humanity, right? Whether that's in the womb or whether that's through, you know, disrupting puberty and things like that. This is, you know, part of a larger agenda that has to do with this phenomenon of disembodiment, right? So there's a when we pathologize all these things, that's actually a product of trauma through disembodiment. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So one way to keep command over one's will is to keep command over one's attention center, right? And this is both an external and an internal practice. So externally, the will is directed, as I said, by this outer screen, oftentimes, of manufactured narratives through media, academia, social media, etc. And internally, there's also a subversion screen, right? Which is the ongoing onslaught of thoughts, feelings, traumas, and dramas that constantly run like a movie. So the key is to keep our attention aligned with our conscious intention, right? And keep a balance between these inner and outer screens. So we don't try to stop the screens and we don't try to fight the screens, especially internally. We sort of hang out right in the space between the two screens. Remaining in a balanced perspective between this inner and outer screen so that our actions are based on something more objective than this endless stream of matrix narratives, obviously, whether internal or external. So remember when I said that the will is a product of unconscious, subjective feeling drivers that serve as karmic momentum, combined with thought and image forms that arise in the conscious mind, which drive the will forward. Well, when you practice something like yoga nidra regularly, when you practice embodiment through interoception, when you practice open and focused attention in the body, and when you practice brain hemisphere synchronization in the body, then this process of driving the will center becomes conscious and full of intention. So through these techniques, we learn how to direct our attention with our intention rather than being led around by the nose by inner and outer mind control mechanisms. And this intention is not something that we impose on our attention in some superficial mental way, right? This intention is actually a living mechanism. It actually arises from the human spirit, but it arises from within the heart. And it's something we align with from within that we allow to move us, right? And so in yoga, this is called the sankalpa. And sankalpa is a Sanskrit term in yogic philosophy that refers to a heartfelt desire, a solemn vow, an intention, or a resolve to do something. It's similar to the English concept of a resolution, except that it comes from even deeper within and tends to be an affirmation. So it comes from the Sanskrit roots san, probably pronounced, meaning a connection with the highest truth, and kalpa meaning vow. Thus it translates to denote an affirming resolve to do something or achieve something spiritual. So it's not really necessarily like a goal, which is a personal need to accomplish something. The concept of sankalpa turns inward to connect with the heart's highest intentions. So you're really connecting with the human spirit at this point. So, and while a goal can be thought of as a person's individual will or personal subjective will, right? The sankalpa is a universal will. So this is where I was talking in my last video about how the divine will meets the individual will through the I am consciousness in this will center. So this is the center of our personhood. This is the center of our, you could say this is the center where our ego is fully developed. But when we align that with a deeper creative purpose through the heart's intention, right? Through the human spirit, then it will align with what we would call our higher self or a higher purpose or a soul mission or whatever. So it's often a declaration or an affirmation such as peace is my true nature rather than the ego driven, I want peace in my life. So that should make sense to everyone. And it's most resonant during Yoga Nidra, which I'm going to do in the second half of this video. I'll lead you through a Yoga Nidra exercise. And the reason it's good to birth an intention within something like Yoga Nidra is because you're in that really deep state of relaxation where the nervous system is in that parasympathetic state that I talk about a lot. And in this way, that intention actually gets written into the subconscious mind. So it will start to carry you if you practice this enough. You don't have to carry it anymore. That intention will move you. It will move your will and direct you. Okay, so I'll do this later. All right, so moving right along. One important sort of technique or thing that we learn along the way with meditation and yoga is this open attention versus focused attention state of mind. And it becomes important to know how to do both. And a lot of mental illness, or what we might call ADD or ADHD, this is not a diagnosis. This is not me saying I know how to fix it, but it's oftentimes where the attention is too easily pulled into this too open of an attention where it gets scattered very easily. So learning how to master open attention and focus attention becomes a deep part of the yoga, the evolution of yourself through yoga and through this meditation. And let's see, the open attention is when you're basically kind of out focused completely in your attention center, and you're taking in, oftentimes you're taking in all your senses at once. I taught that in the sense meditation in one of my videos. You could just be taking in all the sounds at once. You could be taking in, like, you know, an expanded awareness of all the sensations in the body at once. You could be taking in the sensations of the body while you're taking in the sounds and the smells and everything else. And what this does is it puts you in a super, super, super receptive, relaxed state. And this is where we tap into guidance. This is where we're in a receptive state, a feminine receptive state, where knowing and guidance and direct intuition can come through. So it's a very different state than thinking, which a lot of you have probably already experienced, right? So the focused attention state, which is a more masculine state, it's that side of the brain that's more masculine. It's exercising that side of the brain. This is going to be more where we direct our attention at a singular object or thought or idea. And a lot of times in yoga, this is when you're using your drishti. So in a yoga posture, right, like take headstand, for example, you pick a spot on the floor in front of you, a certain distance out, and then you focus really intensely on that spot while you're maintaining your balance. And this, you end up mastering this kind of focused awareness. And this trains the mind to get into a different alignment than the thinking, conceptual, sort of abstract mind. And so in yoga, you're actually oftentimes switching back and forth between open and focused attention. And this is because you're using interoception, which is when you look into your body to find different alignments, right? When you're breathing into the body and you're looking into your body and you're moving energy in the body, you're using this form of interoception. And this is actually a little bit more of an open attention because you're actually waiting to receive guidance on an internal alignment, because that actually comes through the body's intelligence. And at the same time, you may be intensely focused with your eyes on a spot on the wall, depending on what posture you're in. And so this combined it's a synchronization of the brain hemispheres that I talk about so much. And it actually brings all your parts, everything together. And within that, there's a wholeness, right, that's reached. And this is where awakening and individuation happens. So this can also be seen through, again, that lens of masculine, feminine that I keep bringing up. And this focus attention versus open attention is accomplished a lot through practices like yoga nidra, because you're actually switching back and forth within the body and synchronizing those brain hemispheres, as you'll see later when we go through it. So another thing that I've talked about a little bit before that becomes really important is this, observation versus subjective experience. And the external ideological possessions we see lately are largely a product of an imbalance in the subjective self dominating objective awareness. So subjective feeling states should be validated and nurtured. They should not be rejected and they should not be repressed, but they also should not be allowed to direct the will without balance with objective thought and analysis, or we could just say objective observation. So we always need to be finding that balance. And so one of the ways we find that, we master that balance again between objective versus subjective is through these biointelligent practices, through interoception, through observing the thoughts, feelings, sensations, through observing the sensations in the body, and training the mind to switch back and forth and understand the difference between observation and our subjective feeling states, right? So with interoception in practices like yoga nidra, we often practice a sort of neutrality with certain body states, as well as conjuring up opposing body states to master our awareness within them. So we might go from hot to cold. We might imagine opposite states, anxiety and calm, on purpose in yoga nidra, so that we can actually nurture balance within those opposing states. So that's one of the things we do with yoga nidra. There's also oftentimes some visualization and exploration in mastering the inner screen, right? So when we practice visualization, what we're doing is we're actually mastering our inner screen and how it's projected. We can consciously project, but sometimes we just watch our inner screen and practice watching it while staying sort of neutral and not necessarily going to act on it or weaving it through the will. Okay, so dissociation, I feel like that's spelled so weird. I always pronounce it disassociation, but it's dissociation. Dissociation and disembodiment are a huge problem right now. And we can see this all around us if we look. When we are disembodied, it's very easy for dangerous ideologies to take hold in the mind and drive the will. And the transgender to transhumanism movement is all about dissociation and disembodiment. And what it does is it derails the individuation process of young people through mind control mechanisms of all kinds. But at the heart of it, okay, is this intention coming from the top-down agenda that it is, and the already underlying problem of disembodiment in adolescents and teenagers. So it is impossible to deliver a transhumanist agenda to a fully embodied human being. But when one is over-identified or associated with an outer ideology, when they take that on as their identity completely, without any internal alignment, right? That internal alignment that they have it's only aligned with subjective feeling states. It's not aligned with their true individual, liberated spirit self. Okay, so I've talked about how these ideologies latch onto our traumas. Well, that's exactly what's happening, is these subjective feeling states are being validated without question, and then this ideology is latching on. But at the heart of this is this phenomenon where the person is not fully, there's some trauma somewhere where they're not fully embodied. They don't feel right in their body, right? And this is actually really common at puberty. It's very common to not feel right in your body at, from the age of whatever, 12 to 18. I mean, I don't know if I felt fully right in my body until my 20s, when I really started, until I really started doing yoga and coming into conscious awareness in my body and stuff. So they've taken something that's like a really natural process of individuation, and they're interfering with that process of individuation, and they're coming in and they're replacing it with an empty ideological identity that then drives the will. And where does it drive the will? It drives the will further away from the self. It drives the will more toward technology, more toward empty ideology, and away from one's own body first, your biology. But when you're driven away from your biology, you're driven away from your humanity. And when you're driven away from your humanity, you're driven away from your spirit. And when you're driven away from your spirit, you're driven away from your soul, obviously, and your individuation process, your awakening process, right? So this growing problem also stems from the modern day adolescent experience of seeking and finding their identity through social media to such a large degree. Now, we didn't have that. If you're watching this and you're my age, I didn't grow up, I didn't even have a computer in the house till I was like 15, I think. I didn't even know how to use a computer. I mean, I was not plugged into the social media world even till the last maybe 10 years or something. So when your mind grows up with that, your identity starts to form outside your body. And this is even a problem before social media came along. Disembodiment is a big problem. And it's one of the biggest problems with people becoming kind of subverted, is that they're not fully in the body. A lot of us aren't fully in the body. We don't even realize it. It's so easy. Think about how easy it is to just be lost in your thoughts and obsessing about something, and you have no fucking idea what your body's going through in that moment. Sorry about the F-bomb. So, but social media has such a big influence on this. And it's basically, like I said, it's a false individuation through this outer screen that disconnects from the body and subverts the will entirely. So this is why, for me, it's becoming important to understand this biointelligence, the biointelligence of how we become fully embodied and become, align this will with our own inner divine will, get our intention activated, and move from that embodied place, right? So often, again, at the heart of this issue is the important distinction between direct experience and abstract thought, or gnosis versus dogma. So when we experience life purely through concepts versus through direct experience, right, in the body, then we also run the risk of being subverted to outside ideological programming. So earlier I talked about like letting the subjective experience completely drive the will, right? And that can be a problem if we always validate feeling states, if we always validate them and they're never in balance with the objective mind, right? But it can also be a problem if we approach everything from a pure sort of abstract thought, like a conceptual place. If we experience everything from a conceptual place, we can also be subverted because we're not fully embodied in the intuition, the feminine aspects, the intuition, the direct knowing, and the sensorial understanding of the field and the world around us. So that there's a balance there. And that's often what's happening is the person is actually fragmenting away from some aspect that feels uncomfortable, and then going into this sort of abstract, disconnected conceptual realm around the ideology, because it helps protect them from this part of themselves that they feel really uncomfortable with. And in that world, it's the gender. They feel really uncomfortable, they think, with their gender, but it's probably more feeling really uncomfortable with some aspect of being embodied, right? So let's see where I am. So if you aren't embodied through the will center, then it's easy to just subvert to collective beliefs and ideas unconsciously. And this is where this, again, this process of mastering open and focused attention in the body, this practice of interoception and brain hemisphere syncing in the body becomes so important. And this is why Yoga Nidra, or this form of Yoga Nidra that I'm going to show you or guide you through, is so awesome. And again, this entire conversation can be seen through the lens of the balance of masculine and feminine. I hope I'm not becoming too redundant with that. I think it's pretty pertinent to the cultural conversation with everything that's going on. But particularly the problem of disembodiment is healed through the feminine principle. And this is where we're at on the planet right now, is there has been for a long time, and there still is, and it's a growing problem, is this disconnection from the divine feminine principle. It's a disconnection from, you could even say, the theologies and the religions that were more goddess-based. It's a disconnection from our direct relationship to nature through our bodies. And with that, we see these symptoms of these young people just at war within themselves, at war with their own body, right? Because our humanity in the body comes through the feminine principle. It needs to be in balance with the masculine. Otherwise, what we see is we see this outrageous, subjective, distorted stuff, right? That's a shadow feminine. But the true feminine principle, that comes through that. So, and it needs to be in balance with the masculine, obviously. But I think this is the root of this issue, and this is why we see that as women, we could be so disconnected from the humanity in our own wombs. That is a disconnect from humanity in general, and it's a disconnect from the divine feminine principle, right? And our young people being at war with themselves, like I said, this is that divine feminine principle. And the way to get in touch with the divine feminine principle is not only through the heart, but it's through coming back into embodiment, right? So I cannot emphasize that enough, that is so critical to our time. And that this divine feminine principle is under direct attack. It is under direct attack. And I'm not going to apologize anymore for calling out this trans agenda. I'm so sorry for the people at the bottom that are being subverted. I know you're victims. I get it. I have compassion for you, but this is a top-down agenda. And it's a hyper-masculinized attack on the divine feminine. That's all it is. They're dressing up as women, to try to get away with it, but it's the same thing. So this is one of those things, like, we need to stop pussyfooting around about this stuff. I should say I need to, because I have been a little bit. It's like, I don't want to make people feel bad for who they are. I understand what a struggle identity is and what a struggle that is growing up, especially. But we've got to stand up at some point and call out what's going on and protect the innocent, right? Who's going to protect them if we don't? So anyway, second half is going to be, like I said, this Yoga Nidra script. It's really cool. I hope you all enjoy it. And I'll see you next time. Okay? Mwah!